Hey there, boys and girls. We are back for another fantastic chapter in our Magic Treehouse story, A Perfect Time for Pandas. Now, last chapter that we read yesterday, Jack and Annie were in a crazy natural event. It was when the earth starts to shake and things start falling down. An earthquake occurred in the town that they were in. Now, their bikes got crushed, and so they didn't know how to get back to town or how to maybe get back to the Panda Center. So they had a decision to make. They pulled out that magic potion, didn't they, from Jack's backpack. And what did they do? They drank that magic potion. And this chapter is going to talk to us and tell us all about what happens. The title of our chapter is Jack the Giant. So, boys and girls, think for a moment before we start a chapter, what do you think it might be about? The title of the chapter is Jack the Giant. So what tells you or gives you a hint as to what it might be about? Think about it for a moment. All right. Tell your mom or dad or someone that's next to you, what might our next chapter be about, guys? Did you guys get a chance? You guys were able to share? Oh, awesome. Good job. All right, so sit back and enjoy the chapter. Chapter 7, Jack the Giant. Jack felt as if someone was gripping his head and pulling him up and up and up and up. He looked down and watched his arms and hands stretch out. His legs grew longer and his feet grew bigger. Jack rocked back and forth, then stood still. He had stopped stretching and growing. His shoes, clothes, and backpack had all grown bigger to fit his new body. Jack! Annie's voice sounded so distant. Peering through the dust, Jack looked around for Annie. Jack, no, I'm down here. Jack looked down. Annie was standing next to him. She only came up to his knees. I dropped the bottle and it broke, she said. I didn't get to drink any of the potion. Oh no, Jack boomed. Even his voice was big. I'm so sorry. You're huge, said Annie. How does it feel? It looks fun. Look at those illustrations. Look at Annie and look at Jack. Wow. Not yet, said Jack. The earth trembled again, and another aftershock. Annie lost her balance and fell. Jack leaned over and picked her up with both hands. He placed her on one of his giant shoulders. Whoa, said Annie. This is cool. Now I'm taller than you. I can be your lookout. From their new height, Jack and Annie could see over the rumble and the vast devastation. All of the damage, everything that had happened. Trees down in the valley had been uprooted. The river was wild and raging. The mountaintops were covered with dark clouds. It's starting to rain again, said Annie. That's the least of our problems, said Jack. I just hope the earthquakes didn't destroy the Panda Center. I know, let's hurry. We only have an hour, said Annie. Annie held on to Jack's head, and Jack held on to Annie's leg. She lifted one giant foot, and he stepped over the boulder that had crushed their bikes. Picking his way through the rubble, he headed back to the Panda Center. He stepped over fallen debris, power lines, and deep cracks in the road. His giant sneakers crushed twigs and branches. Jack stepped over huge mounds of mud as if they were tiny little anthills. He kicked away boulders as if they were soccer balls. He tossed aside a giant fallen tree as if it were a broken little branch. He leapt over a river of water, cruising down the mountain as if it were rain puddle. "This is incredible," said Jack. "Watch out," said Annie. A boulder was rolling down the wet road towards them. Jack spread his legs wide, and the boulder went right between them and kept rolling downhill. Jack and Annie laughed so loudly. "Now we are having fun," she said. Jack nodded. "Maybe a little bit." Suddenly, a tree crashed across the road. Jack stumbled over it. He fell to the ground just as a wall of mud came rushing down the mountain slope. The black ooze was filled with rock fragments and plants. "Annie!" thought Jack. He lifted his head out of the mud before it smothered him. He reached around and felt Annie's kicking feet. He pulled her out of the thick, wet goo. "Are you okay?" Jack shouted. "Yes," sputtered Annie, "but we're sliding over the cliff." Annie was right. With the force of the strong mud pushing them across the highway all the way towards the cliff. Jack clutched Annie under one of his huge arms. Then he struggled through the grimy ooze until they were clear of the mudslide. Covered with mud from their hair to their shoes, Jack felt heavy and uncomfortable. He had mud in his mouth, and he put Annie down and sat on the road for a moment. "At least we're safe," said Annie. Jack coughed, gagging on mud. "You look like a giant swamp monster," Annie said. Jack couldn't talk. As the rain fell harder, he threw back his head and let the rainwater wash his face and fill his mouth. He choked and spit and coughed until his throat was clear. With help from the pelting rain, he washed the mud off of his bare arms and his shirt, his jeans and his sneakers. Finally, he looked at Annie. "How long do you think I've been a giant now?" he asked hoarsely. I don't know. It seems like a long time, maybe an hour." "We'd better get moving. We only have an hour," he said. "What do we do if you're still a giant when we get to the center?" said Annie. "I'll hide outside," said Jack, "until I'm small again." He figured the last thing the staff needed now was to see a 20-foot-tall kid. Slowly, they both stood up, soaking wet, but cleaner. Jack lifted Annie's back onto his shoulder. He began striding uphill, again sloshing through the mud puddles and stepping over crushed rocks. Jack walked through the falling rain, never stopping, but by the time he reached the Panda Center, he was so tired he could barely take another step. With Annie on his shoulder, Jack stood on the bank of the river, and they stared across the damage from the earthquake. The parking lot was filled with mud. The center sign had been knocked down. Portions of the bridge had collapsed into the river, and fallen brush and debris were piled up on the other side of the entrance gate. The slopes had surrounded the center, where now, gray and bare, landslides had stripped them of all of their bushes. "If it's a bad outside the center," Jack said, "I wonder how bad it is inside the center." "How do we get inside?" said Annie, staring down the raging river. Don't worry," said Jack. "I'm pretty sure I'm tall enough to wade across the river." He took a deep breath, then he stepped into the river. The cold water swirled around his waist. The current nearly knocked him over. Slowly and carefully, he stepped around a huge rock that had rolled into the river. Suddenly, Jack felt his body start to quake. What do you think's happening? Is it another aftershock? Or is Jack going back to normal? Another aftershock, he thought. He paused, but his body kept shaking. As Jack shook, he started to grow smaller and smaller and smaller. In an instant, he had shrunk back to his normal size. He and Annie plunged into the swift, churning water. Jack grabbed a branch of a fallen tree, clinging to the branch. He looked around frantically for Annie. He was holding onto a log. "Here!" shrieked Jack. He reached out his hand, and Annie grabbed it. As the water swirled around them, he pulled her over to him. "Can we get to the bridge?" cried Annie. "Try!" yelled Jack. They both let go of the branch and swam through the water until they grabbed on a piece of the wrecked bridge. Jack and Annie hoisted themselves up onto the slab of concrete. Jack pointed to the part of the bridge that still stood at the edge of the river. He took another deep breath and leapt over the big gap onto the broken bridge. Annie followed. Jack and Annie clung tightly to a piece of the bridge railing and started at the entrance gate of the Panda Center. Muddy branches and rocks and leaves were piled onto each other. "I think we can climb over," said Annie. She led the way, stepping onto the rail next to the gate. Jack followed her. They climbed over the gate and kept climbing over the heap of branches and brush and rocks that blocked the entrance. When they reached the top of the wreckage, they looked down. Staff members were rushing around with buckets, shovels, and first aid kits. When Master Li and Dr. Ling caught sight of Jack and Annie, they both stopped in their tracks and gasped at them. "Hi there," Annie called. Can we help?" And that's the end of chapter 7. Wow, so Jack and Annie have been through so many crazy experiences. I want you guys, in your journal entry today for chapter 7, I want you to go in and I would love for you to illustrate and label something that you learned today. Now, Jack and Annie did a lot of stuff, and there were a lot of things that happened. But what is something that you might have learned that you didn't know of before we started reading the chapter? Maybe it's something about the earthquakes. Maybe it's something about the setting. Maybe it's something about what they saw. What is something that you learned in our chapter today? So I would love for you guys to illustrate and do your best to label some of those pictures so that the readers, like Mr. Riley or your moms or dads, know what's in your illustrations. And if writers, you can write a sentence or two about what you learned, do that. Do your best and try your hardest. Keep those finger spaces, have those punctuation marks, and don't forget your capitals at the beginning. All right, guys, so have some fun today. I hope you guys are still working hard and doing your best. And we will get to chapter 8 tomorrow. All right, guys, have a great day. Miss you. Adios.